No one expected a silent Filipino janitor to step onto the AGT stage. He didn't come with a family, a manager, or a cheering crowd, just an old guitar and a trembling smile. But when he whispered, "This is for someone I lost," and the music began, the entire auditorium fell silent. And Simon Cowell leaned forward. Renard had become an invisible part of the arena. Not because people were unkind, but because no one expected greatness to come from a man pushing a mop. Every week, he worked the night shift backstage, quietly sweeping floors while contestants rehearsed under bright lights. They arrived with designer outfits, cheering families, vocal coaches, and managers who hyped them up. Renard arrived alone, carrying nothing but a lunchbox and an old guitar case he never opened at work. He never complained, never drew attention. He smiled politely, held doors open, and picked up things others dropped. When contestants talked about their dreams, he listened, never mentioning his own. But late at night, when the arena was empty and the echo of applause had faded, Renard sat in the very last row of seats and softly strummed Elvis songs, the same ones he used to sing with his father in small bars across their hometown in the Philippines. His father wasn't just a parent, he was Renard's mentor, duet partner, and biggest believer. "We don't need to be rich to be great," his father used to say. "We just need to sing with the truth." They sang for crowds of 20 people, sometimes 10, sometimes none, but always with passion. And every time Renard sang, his father would clap and yell, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is my son." That voice never left his memory. But after his father passed away unexpectedly 2 years ago, Renard stopped performing publicly. Dreams became too heavy, and survival became the priority. He moved abroad to work, not as a singer, but as a janitor. He swept floors to send money home. He stayed strong for his family, even while missing a piece of himself. The old guitar remained his only connection to the stage he once imagined. On the day of the AGT audition shoot, everything felt normal. The same routines, the same echoes of excitement from others. But something unusual happened. A contestant, overwhelmed with pressure, quit minutes before going on stage. Panic erupted among staff. They needed a filler act immediately to keep the schedule. Everyone was searching for a solution when Renard stood quietly nearby, holding his mop. His heart pounded so hard, it felt like it might break through his chest. For the first time since arriving in America, he spoke a dream aloud. "I can sing. If you need someone, I can perform." The room fell into an awkward silence. A janitor, wearing a faded work uniform. No vocal coach, no paperwork, no preparation. A producer shook his head, but one assistant paused and asked, "Do you really sing?" Renard swallowed hard and nodded. With shaking hands, he opened the guitar case. Inside was a weathered, lovingly preserved instrument. Not expensive, not flashy, but cared for like treasure. When he gently strummed the first chord, even in that busy hallway, something shifted. It wasn't just music, it was memory, love, grief, and truth. The assistant didn't hesitate. "Get him on stage." Renard's eyes widened, his hands trembled. For a moment, he imagined his father standing beside him again, whispering, "Take your chance, son." And the chance he thought he'd lost forever was suddenly real. The stage of America's Got Talent had always looked enormous from Renard's spot behind the curtain. But now, as he stood preparing to walk onto it, it felt even larger, endless, intimidating. Brighter than anything he'd ever seen. The blinding lights washed over him as a stagehand placed a microphone in his hand. It didn't matter that he was in a work uniform, that his shoes were scuffed, or that his guitar was old. What mattered was that this moment, the one he'd buried for years, had finally come back for him. The audience wasn't expecting him. They were expecting the glamorous contestant who had dropped out minutes earlier. So when Renard stepped onto the stage, the murmurs began instantly. "Is he a janitor? What is he doing up there? Where's his family?" He didn't have a cheering section. No posters. No supporters waving his name. Just a trembling smile and a heart full of memories. The judges took him in curiously. Heidi leaned forward, Howie squinted. Sophia offered an encouraging smile. But Simon, Simon stared with unmistakable skepticism. "What's your name?" Simon asked Renard. He replied softly, his Filipino accent gentle but clear. "And what are you doing here today?" The tone wasn't rude, just realistic. It wasn't a question asked to humiliate him. It was a question asked because no one could understand why the janitor was suddenly under the spotlight. Renard swallowed, gripping the guitar strap to steady his shaking hands. I want to sing a song. For my father." Some audience members giggled at his shyness. Simon raised an eyebrow. "All right," Simon said, leaning back. "Well, good luck." 2 words that sounded polite, but also like doubt. Renard closed his eyes for just a second. 1 second to gather himself. 1 second to remember the tiny bar in the Philippines. The way his father would nudge him forward, whispering, "Don't hide your voice. It was given to you for a reason." 1 second to remember the nights he'd worked 3 jobs just to help his family survive. And how every time he felt weak, he wished he could hear his father say, just one more time, "I'm proud of you." When he opened his eyes again, the world looked different, calm, intentional, focused. He leaned toward the microphone and whispered, almost to himself, "Dad, I hope you can hear me." The audience quieted instantly at the intimacy of the moment. He strummed the first chord. It was imperfect, raw, human, trembling. But within that sound lived every year of sacrifice, every broken dream, every moment of love he never stopped carrying. The chord echoed around the arena like a voice from the past. A hush swept through the room. Even Simon leaned forward. Renard lifted his head, breathed in deeply, and began to sing Elvis' legendary song, the one he and his father sang together so many times that the lyrics felt tattooed on his soul. This was no longer a janitor singing. This was a son reaching across time to honor the man who taught him how to dream, and the world. Every single person in that arena stopped to listen. The very first line left the audience stunned, but Renard didn't mimic Elvis, he felt Elvis. His voice wasn't a copy. It was a memory carried across oceans, across loss, across time. It was deep, yet tender, broken, yet unshakably loyal to the song. Every note sounded like it was pulled from somewhere inside his chest that had never fully healed. The room, once restless and judgmental, became still. Teenagers who were scrolling on their phones paused their thumbs. Couples leaned closer. Older audience members, who grew up with Elvis, widened their eyes in disbelief. Even the camera operators stopped shifting, instinctively sensing that something unforgettable was happening. Renard didn't look at the judges, the audience, or the cameras. He sang with his eyes closed, as if the stage had disappeared and he was somewhere far away, a smoky bar in the Philippines, where his father sat across from him, tapping his foot to the beat with pride shining in his eyes. As the chorus approached, years of silence and grief caught up with him. His voice cracked just slightly, not out of weakness, but because pain had finally been allowed to breathe. And instead of turning people away, that imperfection hit deeper than perfection ever could. Someone in the front row covered her mouth, crying quietly. A man who once mocked him earlier whispered, "My God, he's incredible." The cameras turned to the judges. Heidi blinked fast, visibly holding back tears. Sophia placed a hand over her heart. Howie shook his head in disbelief, the kind of disbelief reserved for pure talent. But the most shocking reaction came from Simon. He didn't move at first. He didn't smile, didn't frown. He simply watched, eyes intense, unguarded. The way he watches when someone reveals greatness. By the midway point of the song, something extraordinary happened. Renard opened his eyes and looked toward the ceiling, as though searching beyond the lights, beyond the rafters, for the one person who wasn't there. His voice filled with longing, not for approval, not for applause, but for a father he desperately wished could hear him. And in that moment, the entire arena understood the truth. Renard wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing closure. As he reached the final verse, his voice grew stronger, not louder, but braver. Each note felt like a goodbye, like a release, like a man choosing hope over heartbreak. The audience began swaying gently without even realizing it, drawn into his world. Then came the final note. Long, powerful, trembling, as though he refused to let go, not of the lyric, but of the memory. When the note faded, there was no immediate applause, just silence. A silence so heavy it had weight. It wasn't because people didn't want to clap. It was because no one wanted to break the moment. A moment so raw, it demanded reverence. Renard lowered his guitar slowly. His chest heaved. His eyes shimmered with tears he tried so hard not to shed. And before anyone could speak, before a single hand clapped, a single tear rolled down Simon Cowell's cheek. The silence after the final note lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like eternity. Renard kept his head down, thinking just for a moment that he had failed. His heartbeat was so loud he could barely hear anything else. Maybe they still saw him as just a janitor. Maybe this moment wasn't meant for him after all. Maybe this dream was never his to keep. Then, suddenly, the room erupted. The audience rose to their feet in one synchronized motion, as if pulled upward by the force of what they had just experienced. Thunderous applause shook the entire arena. People cheered with their hands in the air, some still crying, some with smiles wider than they had worn in years. Renard lifted his head in shock. Heidi stood first, clapping with both hands above her head. Sophia shouted, "Bravo! Bravo!" through tears. Howie looked stunned, shaking his head in disbelief. And Simon simply stared, unmoving. The applause quieted gradually, as everyone waited for him, for the judge whose approval meant the most. He leaned toward the microphone. "Renard," Simon began, his usually sharp voice softer than anyone had ever heard it. "I've heard thousands of singers in my life. Thousands. Many of them technically exceptional. But what you just did," he paused, collecting himself. "You reminded every single person in this room what music is supposed to be." The crowd cheered again, but Simon lifted his hand, signaling he wasn't finished. "You didn't come here looking for fame. You came here because you loved someone," Simon continued. "That's why your voice hit harder than any performance tonight. It wasn't perfect, it was true, and truth is rare." Renard's lips trembled. He tried to speak, but emotion held his voice hostage. "I just wanted to make my father proud," he whispered. That sentence, those 6 simple words, unlocked something in the room. Simon rose slowly from his chair. The judges looked at one another, knowing exactly what he was about to do. The audience gasped and began screaming before he even touched the button. Simon stepped forward, and with the intensity of a man honoring a moment larger than talent, he slammed the golden buzzer. The world exploded in gold. Confetti burst into the air like fireworks, dancing around Renard in a shower of light and glitter. He dropped to his knees, clutching the guitar to his chest, as if it were the only lifeline keeping him from collapsing completely. The crowd chanted his name, Reynard. Reynard, Reynard. Stagehands rushed out, embracing him with pride. Sophia came to the stage, wrapping her arms around him in a heartfelt hug. Heidi held his hand. Howie patted his shoulder, overwhelmed. Simon didn't rush. He waited until the applause faded slightly, then approached Renard with the quiet dignity of someone who understood pain. He placed a hand on Renard's shoulder and said, "Only one sentence. Your father would be so proud, and so are we." Renard cried openly for the first time in years. Not because he won, not because he got the golden buzzer, but because someone finally saw him, not as a janitor, not as a nobody, but as an artist, and as a son. The confetti eventually settled, the lights dimmed, and the stage crew began clearing the floor, but Renard stayed frozen in the moment, trying to breathe through tears that felt years overdue. The golden buzzer wasn't just a career milestone, it was something deeper, something he hadn't expected to feel again: belonging. Backstage was a whirlwind of celebration. Contestants he had once quietly swept past now rushed to hug him. Producers who barely noticed him before shook his hand like he'd always been a star. Camera crew members who had walked past him 1,000 times now asked for interviews and pictures. But amidst all the noise, Renard stood still, holding his guitar close. He looked overwhelmed, not by attention, but by gratitude. He didn't crave fame. He just wanted to honor the man who taught him to sing. Simon approached quietly, giving the camera space to capture the rawness of the moment, without turning it into a spectacle. He stopped just in front of Renard, not smiling big, not trying to appear dramatic, simply present. "You don't owe anyone anything from this moment forward," Simon said. "You've already honored your father. The rest of this, the success, the fame, it's just a bonus." Renard lowered his eyes, trying to hold back the emotion. "I never expected this," he said softly. I didn't want to be forgotten." Simon nodded, not out of pity, but out of recognition. "People who sing from the heart," he said, "are never forgotten." The production team asked Simon to move for more backstage shots, but he stayed until Renard was steady again. Not because it was television, because it was human. Later, after the filming wrapped, Renard sat alone in a quiet hallway, the same hallway he used to mop. He looked at his uniform folded beside him, his shinier new contestant badge squeezed between his fingers, two worlds colliding. He smiled through tears. "We did it, Dad," he whispered to the empty corridor. He didn't notice someone sitting nearby until a young girl approached with hesitation. She had been crying earlier while watching him perform. "Sir," she said shyly, "my dad passed away too. And when you sang, it made me feel like he was still here." Renard's heart tightened. The girl hugged him quickly, then ran back to her mother. In that small exchange, Renard understood something powerful. His performance wasn't only for his father anymore. It was for every person who had loved and lost, everyone holding on to memories that time could never erase. That night, social media exploded with his performance. Millions of views, thousands of comments. People from the USA, the Philippines, and all over the world shared stories of their loved ones, tagging him in messages filled with gratitude and healing. Renard didn't become famous because he sang perfectly. He became unforgettable because he sang honestly. His future wasn't guaranteed. There would be challenges, pressure, expectations, but one thing had already changed forever. He no longer saw himself as invisible. He no longer questioned if his father would be proud. He knew. And as he walked out of the arena, no longer sweeping the floors, but walking toward his new life, a warm breeze passed through the night air, almost like a gentle clap on the back, as though someone was still cheering for him.